And joining us now for a discussion on Trump's executive order banning men from women's sports is Alex Newman, award-winning international journalist and president of Liberty Sentinel Media. So, Alex, as you heard just now, Trump's executive order targets schools receiving federal funding, and they'll lose access to that source of money if they violate Title IX. What about schools that choose to forego federal funding? Would they still be able to continue allowing men in women's sports?
Thank you for having me. And yes, absolutely. The federal funding is really the leverage point that the federal government has on these types of issues. And unfortunately, this is also the tool that multiple Democratic administrations have used to foist a lot of these ideas on public schools and other institutions in conservative leaning states. So any school that's not taking federal funding, which unfortunately is not a lot of public schools, almost every public school in this country in almost every state is taking federal money in some way, is going to be subject to this. But any school that is not attached to federal funding would be able to continue doing whatever it wanted to. And I'm sure some will.
And how effective do you think this will play out, in terms of achieving its goals?
Well, I think for the next 4 years, this is a slam dunk. There will be very few schools, I think, that continue to allow this, understanding that they're going to risk probably somewhere close to 10% of their budget if they do that. I suspect there will be some that try. I suspect there will be a lot of lawsuits that tie this up for a while. But I think while Trump is in the White House, it's a pretty safe bet that this is going to be effective. But a lot of people are forgetting that in 4 years, we're going to have another election. And at that point, we don't know who will be the next president. And if these tools remain in place, these same tools could very well be used to do exactly what Joe Biden did during his administration, which is to flip this upside down and reimpose the gender ideology on public schools across the country. So I think one of the things that Donald Trump has talked about, shutting down the U.S. Department of Education, would actually be a more effective way of protecting public schools over the long term from this kind of stuff. But he's going to need backing from Congress.
So the NCAA and other sports organizations have allowed transgender athletes to compete in women's divisions. How do you see this executive order affecting their policies?
Well, I think the executive order, obviously the president cannot control those institutions, but I think it's a symptom of a public backlash against this kind of ideology. And I think sports organizations like the ones you mentioned are going to have to come to their senses and adapt to this new reality. There really never was public support for this. If you look at the polling data, even Democrats were very, very much opposed to having men in girls' locker rooms, to having men competing against girls in sports. And so I think the zeitgeist, the public response to this kind of stuff is really going to be the key driver. And I think Trump's executive order is really a symptom of that public sentiment more than the other way around. So I think a lot of sports agencies might try to resist this for a little while, but I think over the long term, at least during Trump's administration, they're going to have to surrender on this and wait and see what happens going forward.
Well, bring it back to the U.S., but I want your thoughts on if there's going to be any impact from other countries with this executive order.
Well, I think most of the world never really jumped on this gender bandwagon. There are a few of the Scandinavian countries, a few of the Northern and Western European countries kind of tried out some of this gender stuff, including, by the way, chopping off body parts from children. And a lot of them have now walked that back. So the United States really was an outlier on this. This was really a Biden administration program, and a program that was really very highly ideological. And I think most countries have resisted this trend. You've seen this across Africa, across Latin America, across Asia. You're not seeing a lot of this. Europe was the one region of the world that kind of went along with this, but even they have now really pulled back from the brink. So again, I think Trump is on very solid footing here with public opinion, with the Constitution, as far as international perception is concerned. There is the ideological fringe in the United States, and of course, the people profiting from this who are going to resist it. But I think internationally speaking, Trump's executive order really is following international public opinion.
Do you foresee perhaps certain states, more progressive ones, to push back in federal court?
No question. I have no doubt that states like New York, states like California, states like Illinois and New Jersey are going to try to push back. They're going to sue. I think they're going to lose. Anybody who can read Title IX can see very clearly this was not intended to have men participate in women's sports. In fact, exactly the opposite. It was intended to protect female sports from men. That's why it was passed in 1972. And there's no amount of turning into a pretzel that a federal court could do to try to make this apply to men and women's sports. So I think as far as the federal courts are concerned, especially now, Trump is on very solid ground. But no question about it, some of the more radical Democrat states are going to push back.
So you mentioned earlier that perhaps abolishing the education department may have a longer term effect on this. Can you elaborate on that? What do you mean?
Yeah, the founding fathers never envisioned a system where the federal government would be telling the states what to do on education or really virtually anything else. In fact, the powers of Congress are listed in Article 1, Section 8 of the U.S. Constitution. I encourage people to get familiar with that. The people who wrote the Constitution never would have imagined that the federal government would one day be involved in deciding what bathrooms people should go into. So this is really a radical departure from what was intended by the Constitution, which, by the way, remains the supreme law of the land. And these tools have been usurped over a period of multiple generations where the federal government, using the lever of federal funding, has tried to dictate policy to state and local governments. And unfortunately, we have seen a very clear trend line of more and more federal involvement, more and more radical ideas being pushed through these kinds of mechanisms. So I think one of the things that Trump has articulated very clearly now, going back to his first term, is we've got to stop this federal meddling. And especially on the education front, he's been very clear about his desire to end federal involvement in education and end the U.S. Department of Education. Whether he'll be able to get that accomplished remains to be seen. Even Ronald Reagan set out to do that initially. But if he is able to do that, if he's able to shut down federal involvement in education, I think over the long term, that's going to be a much, much more powerful way of keeping this sort of extremism, not just out of schools, but out of other institutions as well.
All right, Alex, as always, it's very, very enjoyable to talk to you. That's our time today. Thank you very much.
Thank you for having me.